Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Rebecca Moroney. I am a lecturer in Learning Sciences and Development at the University of South Australia. I sit predominantly in the Centre for Change and Complexity in Learning, or C3L, and I have a research interest in human and artificial cognition.
I am Sam Fowler, and I also work at the University of South Australia in the outreach group, where I do a lot of STEM education. But I'm interested in exploring how AI can help students understand higher order thinking effectively.
Hi, I'm Dr. Małgorzata Korolkiewicz. I'm a senior lecturer at UniSA STEM, and I'm also a member of C3L, and my interest is in data analytics and learning analytics. I think a good word to describe it is surprise at the capabilities of ChatGPT and sort of a bit of fear as to what's going to happen next. And I think the timing of the release was important because in Australia, this was the end of the academic year. And then people were starting to think what's going to happen next and what it's going to mean for me.
Yes, I think academic integrity definitely came to a fore within that. But there was also a lot of excitement, I think, from specific people who could see how it could push their teaching forward.
I think a lot of it was driven by the media. So it was our reactions, a lot of clickbait headlines that were obviously attention grabbing and tended to focus on, certain ideas like academic integrity, which is something that you can see in the paper when we followed the trajectory or the title or words used by the media.
In fact, we found there were certain groups of papers that of certain left-wing or right-wing papers that approached it from different angles, and one that we found was ABC and Guardian, were more interested in the new ways we could do it. They addressed academic integrity, but they went beyond that into less clickbaity kind of ways.
Well, the short answer is we don't know because any discussions about policy happened, I guess, behind the closed doors. And as academics on the ground, I think we were left to sort of decide for ourselves whether we know what ChatGPT is and how it might impact our approach to teaching. And probably some people were thinking that this is just another fad that will blow over in a couple of months, and other people jumped straight in, and others were just sort of looking for answers and not necessarily finding any.
I found it was quite discipline specific too. Like a lot of the academics who saw their discipline as being somehow very different from all the other ones thought, oh, it's not going to affect me. But long term, we could see that every week things were changing. And I think there was a bit of fear from just the general group. There were people talking about those water cooler moments when they discuss it, but it took a while for the universities to get their heads around how it was going to be impacting them directly, as I think it's still taking a while to get there. A lot of our analysis, of course, was from the media and from what could be accessed by the public rather than what might be happening behind paywall, behind staff logins and things like that.
I agree, Margazada, as well. I think that a lot of the conversations fell to us as individual academics, and even now, when you give a presentation on ChatGPT and you show all the potential of it, people will then still turn around and put in a question, how do I lose weight? So then people are still using it for a variety of different reasons. So I think those academics that hit the ground running probably were already thinking about ways that they could improve their teaching. Whereas I think most of us that were coming through, even as relatively early adopters, were looking at it in a variety of ways, not just how is it impacting my teaching, but how can I better my life in other ways. So I think that does make it a challenge for universities to implement policies, because I think a lot of the conversations were quite varied. They still are. So
it was also working on different timelines, because there was a short-term timeline of another semester coming up and sort of what are we going to do in the next few months, what, if anything, we can do, and then sort of a longer term timeline, where are we going with that. But yeah, I think the short term thinking sort of was very evident first, or this is what got picked up by a lot of the media outlets. So hence the focus on, academic integrity. Okay, we're doing away with anything digital. We're going back to sort of old school paper exams and that was getting traction in some of the discussions.
So I think there are still academic integrity conversations happening, and rightly so. I don't think that there is a widely accepted or adopted approach on how and when and where large language models or AI applications can be used or where they should be used. In one of my own courses, because as Malgorzata mentioned, it was towards the end of the semester for that study period, so we had this summer to kind of rethink. And during that time, we broke it down into what are we actually trying to get our students to learn? Because ChatGPT wrote the essay that we had originally wanted students to do much better than a lot of our students can. So then it forced us to shift our focus, and so that minimized the academic integrity. It was actually the impetus was put back on us as academics and as teachers to think, what do I need my students to learn by the end of it? And if they then use ChatGPT or another large language model to help them communicate their ideas, that's then a safe, ethical way to do that. So we've seen benefits in, one, changing our assessment to focus more on the process of how students are learning or how they're taking this information and using it, or how they could potentially use it as future teachers. And two, we're actually encouraging the use of it where it needs to be used. So in things like grammar enhancement or sentence structuring, it's quite clear when and where they have used it. And so we can then determine if it's an appropriate amount or not. So I think the conversations around academic integrity are still just as important. But for me, in my particular, these are ed psych-based courses for undergraduate students, it's forced us to rethink our purpose of our assessments. And I think that has actually lessened some of our issues on academic integrity.
Which ultimately will be a good thing that we start to think about different processes that we can explore and looking at how a student learns rather than just the final output that we get at the end. The thing that worries me a little though is there's a lot of academics who become quite stressed about this because it is a lot of work. You did a lot of work to flip your assignment around, and it's going to take time for us all to catch up. And there probably will be lots of academic integrity slipping through the problems, slipping through the nets for a while. But I guess long term it will have a positive effect.
I would like to go back to what we saw in the media discourse in the first 100 days. Mm-hmm. So at some point, I was expecting to maybe be able to track a shift in the narrative, but it actually never happened. So it seems to be two narratives happening in parallel. One about academic integrity, how do we stop it or how do we protect what we normally do from ChatGPT and academic integrity issues associated with that, versus another narrative, which was precisely about what Beck was saying about rethinking the assessment and sort of deciding what it is that we want students to learn and what is the best way to assess it. And what was interesting, and I guess good for us, given that we are at University of South Australia, part of the ATN network, that ATN network tend to be the ones talking more about the potential and sort of changing the focus from how this is going to make what we normally do impossible to thinking more to the future. But in my area, which is more quantitative in nature, I think it's still more wait and see approach. But the best advice that I've heard is to sort of think about how I might use ChatGPT for myself in my work, and then if a student uses it in the same way, then it doesn't seem fair to go after them
That's a great point. And I think academic integrity, we are always going to have students that cheat, unfortunately. So there's always going to be the student that leaves it to the last hour, puts it through ChatGPT, and then submits it in the same way they would have outsourced to a paid tutoring service. So these are not necessarily new conversations, but I think the focus or a refocus onto how am I using it? And if my student is using it in the same way, we can't really, well, I don't think we should punish that.
I feel like larger organisations like the EU and the universities understood AI in a very specific way. It dealt with very specific tools. It looked for cancer or it identified complex mathematical issues. But I don't think that they were ready for the generalist nature, the user friendliness in which they could encounter it and use it, and the way students then could also use it.
I think, Malgorzata, in one of our first conversations we had about this paper, you said something that stuck with me, and it landed in our lap. So it all of a sudden became very tangible. And so it was this far out concept with a lot of misconceptions, that very narrow applications, but all of a sudden it's in our hands. And so I think that we missed the disconnect, or we weren't ready potentially for that to land in our laps. The signs were there, but it didn't. We weren't ready for the practical use, as you said, Sam.
And as much as universities are there to come up with all sorts of new solutions and ideas through research, they're not terribly agile organizations, and they can never react as quickly as industry can and usually does. So I guess in some ways we just got caught off guard, just hoping that business as usual can continue for longer, that will be nothing coming that will put it on its head, in a similar way to the pandemic that forced us to pivot to different ways of doing things.
In fact, I've seen in the secondary schools, for example, they did experimentation into AI and ChatGPT a lot quicker than the university, because they're a small organisation. It's easier for them to try things out and adapt, and we can sometimes learn from them what hasn't worked and what has worked. One of my major concerns is for the well-being of the academics themselves, because our job is essentially challenged in a way by this broad knowledge that's coming on board. No longer are we gatekeepers to knowledge, although there are certain elements of knowledge that ChatGPT still doesn't have access to. But it challenges a lot of people I know to think, well, what is my job? What am I doing? And really, it shouldn't just be imparting knowledge, but a number of academics hold that epistemology, that's their job is to impart knowledge on others. And it's something that we've got to consider, because it could have ramifications further down the line.
Absolutely. And picking up on the wellbeing angle, I think we're missing a lot, and you can see that in the discourse. Not many people are talking about wellbeing. Not many people are talking about the positive or the negative impact it can be having. So I think the conversation at the moment, even now, we're several months past, we're 6-7 months into having ChatGPT, we're still having very similar conversations. It is around academic integrity or academic achievements, and I think we're missing opportunity and potential. And so I do think that is an ethical concern, not considering the well-being of the users, but also making sure that the creators of these applications are creating it for us. At the moment, it does feel like it's still being created to us. But I think something like this, because the barrier to entry has been minimized, there is now the opportunity that we can potentially reduce that bias, reduce that ethical implications, because we can be involved in creating these narratives and generating a different discourse to make sure things like well-being or other conversations that are not just academic achievement are being heard, and by a variety of different people. That's one of the main issues, obviously, is how these applications were created. There is a lot of inherent bias. But Malgorzata, you wanted to speak more to that?
There's certainly inherent bias, because large language models basically pick up on what's out there on the internet, and there's plenty of questionable ideas and sort of biases that are built into some of the discourses that have been published are kind of getting picked up by ChatGPT and I guess propagated further. And on the sort of access issue, I think there is an equity issue coming up because the first version was free, open to anyone. But the newer, more capable versions are starting to be put behind paywalls. So in terms of access, the tool is not as available to everyone as the initial imperfect version was.
Further to access issues, there's access to academic information, because a lot of what we create as academics ends up in papers that are behind paywalls that ChatGPT cannot access, and it kind of values all sources in a similar way. So if our students are searching for the knowledge that I say they might be searching for, they will come up with results that are probably not to the level that we require them to have, because it's not valuing our own knowledge creation that we've done.
I think one of the things we can do as teachers or as educators, though, is teach our students and ourselves to be critical users. So this is a tool in a toolbox. At the moment, the number of AI applications is growing exponentially. Every day there's hundreds of brand new ones. If we expect this to be a magic bullet or a diet pill that's going to solve all of our issues, then we're going to get drawn into these ethical concerns. Whereas like the inability to access information behind paywall, there are other alternative AI applications that are currently on the market that are free, that do access information, research articles. Or there's also the idea that we could shift our practices to be more open science and more transparent. And, again, there are concerns and issues with that as well. But I think if we get stuck down this idea that ChatGPT is the only AI application we can be using, then the ethics and the concerns become as exponential as the growth of other AI applications.
And I think what you said kind of fits also with the way we've said ChatGPT is making us focus on process. It's also getting us to question other things like open source literature and things like that too. So it's changing the world in ways that the designers of it probably didn't think would affect the world, but we've got to be careful to make sure that we have principles as we go forward so that we don't have any ethical issues as well. So I think one of the main problems we've got to deal with is this lack of knowledge, because it's so new and we're all getting our heads around it, and there are different people who will throw themselves into it, for example yourself, and they will come up with great ideas, but I think the rest of the community also needs to be supported by professional development so that they can understand what it can do and the ways that we can use it ethically with our students, but also probably some guiding principles telling us what kind of tasks it's useful for and when shouldn't we use it, when should we use it. It doesn't have to be we all ban it or we all let it all happen. It can be different shades of grey going across there. I think that's really key.
So I would say that banning ChatGPT, the use of large language models, is not an option because they're out there and they are being used and they will be used. So any sort of effort that goes towards prevention is a wasted effort. And as far as the policy goes, I guess as long as it gives a clear guidance as to where the institution stands on ChatGPT, that's a good thing. But what's more important is practical advice for the teachers, sort of how to take the general position and general ideas about the role of ChatGPT in education, if we work out what it is, how to take it to the classroom, how to take it to conversations with the students so that we sort of move in a more positive direction and learn to work with it and get the best out of it rather than always trying to think about what we're losing and how do we perhaps try to prevent loss of things that we've always done when these things no longer work.
A couple of the universities that we looked at when we were looking at their websites actually were attempting to give advice, but there was only a couple, and it was in the minority. And I'm sure there's a lot more out there now than there was back then. In those first 100 days, it was very much the Wild West. We was making up what we wanted to do.
I do think we have a really unique opportunity, and it's something that I didn't see with the advent or the proliferation of social media. People had reactions post social media once online bullying became an issue. Because we have that knowledge and large language models have, just landed in our labs, we can get on top of this. We can make sure that there are guidelines that are specific to a university, so they can be really strict and have all the things that, a university needs, and in there to more broad guidelines that, say, a government could put out about the safe and ethical and transparent use. And I think getting ahead of it will go a long way to making sure we don't see some of those issues that have occurred alongside things like social media, when everybody just accepted it blindly, and now we're stuck with,
the consequences.
The consequences, absolutely, yeah.
It was a snapshot. It showed us an implementation of a groundbreaking new technology and how it impacted universities. But things change and things develop, and they've probably developed quite widely since we've written this paper. Also, a lot of our research was from what was publicly available, and so that meant anything that's behind a staff portal we couldn't access, and therefore we could only get what was there and what was clearly in the media from Australia. Again, that's probably a limitation too, is that we were only just looking at the Australian context, and it might have been reacted to differently overseas, although from my reading, the general patterns seem similar in other countries as well.
I think the other limitation, or what I would liken that to, is a photograph. You don't know what happened before or after, you only have that image there. So that's the intended purpose of this paper, and I think it should be used as such. So maybe it's not a limitation, rather an acknowledgement of why and how we created the paper.